What happens when Hollywood royalty sits down for what should be a simple interview and faces a host determined to turn civility into chaos? In just 36 seconds, one comment would shatter the entire set and leave the audience gasping. This is the moment Clint Eastwood walked off The View, and nobody saw it coming. The studio lights were hot that morning. Clint Eastwood, the legend himself, settled into the chair across from the panel of hosts. He'd done 1,000 interviews, sat through countless talk shows, and always kept his cool. Today would be different. The audience applauded as he sat down, genuine warmth in their reception. Here was a man who'd given them decades of entertainment, who'd become an icon of American cinema. They were excited to hear what he had to say. Whoopi started things off friendly enough. "Clint, it's so good to have you here. We've been fans for years." "Thank you, Whoopi. It's good to be here," Clint responded with that trademark understated charm. Sarah jumped in enthusiastically. "Your new film looks incredible. Can you tell us a little bit about what drew you to this project?" Clint began explaining the story, the themes, why he wanted to make this particular movie at this point in his career. It was all very normal, very standard interview fare. The kind of conversation that happens on talk shows every single day. But Joy Behar was waiting. You could see it in her posture, in the way she was leaning forward, in the way her eyes narrowed as Clint spoke. She wasn't listening to understand. She was listening for ammunition. Joy leaned forward with that look in her eyes. The one that said she wasn't here to chat about movies. She was here to make a moment. "So Clint," she started, her voice dripping with something that wasn't quite friendliness. "You've made a lot of movies about tough guys and heroes. But I have to ask, do you think your generation understands what real heroism looks like today?" The audience stirred. Whoopi Goldberg shifted in her seat. Sonny Hostin glanced sideways at Joy. Everyone could feel the shift in energy, the sudden tension that hadn't been there moments before. Clint smiled, the kind of smile that comes from decades of handling difficult questions. "Well, I think heroism is pretty timeless. A person who stands up for what's right, protects others, does the hard thing when nobody else will. That doesn't change with generations." "Interesting," Joy said. "And you could hear the trap being set. Because it seems to me that your movies glorify a certain type of masculinity that, frankly, is pretty toxic. All that gun violence, the silent brooding tough guy routine. Don't you think that's done real damage to how men see themselves?" A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the friendly chat they'd expected. Clint's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes sharpened just slightly. "I think you might be simplifying complex characters and stories. The men in my films often struggle with violence. They deal with the consequences of their actions. They're not cardboard cutouts." Joy cut him off before he could continue. "But they're still solving their problems with guns, aren't they? They're still the strong, silent types who don't talk about their feelings and just shoot first and ask questions later." Sarah Haynes jumped in, trying to smooth things over. "I think what Joy is trying to say is that cinema has evolved, and..." But Joy cut her off. "No, Sarah, I'm saying exactly what I mean. These cowboy fantasies, these vigilante stories, they're dangerous, and I think someone needs to take responsibility for that." The temperature in the room changed. You could feel it. The easy, friendly atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by something sharp and uncomfortable. Clint's jaw tightened just slightly, but his voice stayed even. "With respect, Joy, I think you're confusing storytelling with advocacy. Movies reflect the human experience. They show conflict, resolution, struggle, and triumph. That's not toxic. That's life." "Life?" Joy laughed, but it wasn't a warm laugh. It was the kind of laugh that cuts. "Life is what we're living right now, where gun violence is out of control, where men think they need to solve everything with aggression. And your movies? They feed that narrative." That's quite an accusation, Clint said, his voice still calm, but with an edge now. You're suggesting that fictional stories are responsible for real-world violence. By that logic, we'd have to blame every form of media for every social problem. Joy leaned in further, sensing she'd struck a nerve. I'm not talking about all media. I'm talking specifically about your movies, your brand of masculinity, your vision of what a man should be. Whoopi tried to intervene. Okay, let's maybe take a step back here and... Joy wasn't stopping. No. Whoopi, this is important. We have a responsibility on this show to ask the tough questions. And I'm asking Clint here if he feels any responsibility at all for contributing to a culture that celebrates violence. The audience was completely silent now. Some looked uncomfortable. Others were leaning forward, sensing drama. Alyssa Farah Griffin spoke up, her voice measured. I actually think there's a difference between depicting something in art and endorsing it in real life. Clint's films often show the consequences of violence, not just the act itself. Thank you, Alyssa, Clint said with a nod. That's exactly right. In Unforgiven, for example, the entire film is about the cost of violence, the weight it puts on a person's soul. It's anti-violence, not pro-violence. Joy waved her hand dismissively. Oh, please, Alyssa. That's such a convenient excuse. Every director says that, but what people remember is the cool guy with the gun, not the consequences. They remember Dirty Harry saying, "Go ahead, make my day," not whatever moral lesson you claim was in there. That's not giving audiences much credit, Sonny interjected. People are capable of understanding nuance and complexity in storytelling. Joy turned on her now. Are they, though, Sonny? Because the statistics on gun violence would suggest otherwise. When young men grow up watching these movies, they internalize these messages. Clint leaned back in his chair. His expression was calm, but something had shifted behind his eyes. Joy, I've spent over 50 years making films. I've told stories about war, peace, justice, injustice, and the complexity of the human spirit. If you want to reduce all of that to some simplistic critique, that's your choice, but it's not accurate, and it's not fair. Not fair? Joy's voice rose, and several people in the audience flinched at the sudden increase in volume. You want to talk about fair? Let's talk about how fair it is that young men watch your movies and think that's how they should behave. Let's talk about how fair it is that women have to deal with men who've been raised on this tough guy nonsense. Clint shook his head slowly. You're making massive leaps in logic, Joy. Millions of people have watched my films and somehow managed not to become violent. Correlation isn't causation. You can't just pick a social problem and blame it on art you happen to disagree with. I'm not disagreeing with your art, Joy shot back, her face flushing. I'm disagreeing with the message behind it, the values it promotes, the worldview it pushes. What worldview is that exactly? Clint asked, his patience clearly wearing thin now. The worldview that says people should stand up for themselves, that they should protect the innocent, that evil exists and sometimes needs to be confronted? Joy slammed her notes down on the desk. The worldview that says violence is the answer. That's what I'm talking about. The audience was dead silent now. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Sonny tried to redirect. I think we can all agree that media influence is complicated, and... Joy interrupted again. No, Sonny, it's not that complicated. Either you're part of the problem or part of the solution. And I think Clint's made it pretty clear which side he's on. That was the line. Clint Eastwood stood up slowly. Not in anger, not in haste, but with the deliberate calm of a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Joy, he said quietly, I came here to talk about my work, to have a conversation, maybe even to disagree respectfully. But you're not interested in conversation. You're interested in a lecture. You want to put me in a box, slap a label on it, and feel righteous about it. I don't need that, and I don't think your audience needs that either. Joy's face flushed red. Excuse me? You don't get to tell me what my audience needs. This is my show. Actually, Whoopi interjected, her voice firm, it's our show, Joy, and I think Clint has a point. Joy spun toward Whoopi. Are you seriously taking his side right now? I'm not taking sides, Whoopi said evenly. I'm saying we invited a guest here, and maybe we should let him speak without attacking him. Joy's eyes flashed. I am letting him speak. I'm just not letting him off the hook for decades of questionable content. Clint shook his head slightly, a sad smile on his face. You know what the real problem is here, Joy? You've already decided who I am, what I represent, what I think. You didn't invite me here for a conversation. You invited me here to be your villain for the day. And I'm not interested in playing that role. Oh, that's rich, Joy shot back. The man who's made millions off playing the hero is upset about being called out. Maybe you're just not used to women standing up to you. The gasp from the audience was audible. Sarah's eyes went wide. Joy, come on, that's not what? Joy demanded. That's not true. Look at his films. How many strong women are actually in charge in his movies? How many times is the woman just the prize or the victim? Alyssa jumped back in. That's actually not accurate at all. If you look at films like $1 Million Baby, or The Bridges of Madison County, or even... Joy cut her off. I'm not interested in cherry-picking examples, Alyssa. I'm talking about the overall pattern. Clint's voice remained steady, but there was steel underneath now. Joy, I've worked with some of the strongest, most talented women in this industry. Meryl Streep, Hilary Swank, Frances McDormand, Angelina Jolie, and not one of them has ever accused me of what you're suggesting. Maybe because they know the difference between a character and a person, between a story and real life. Oh, so now you're going to hide behind your actress friends? Joy's voice was mocking now. That's classic. I have women friends, so I can't possibly be part of the problem. Whoopi stood up now too. Joy, that's enough. You're being disrespectful. Joy whirled on her. Disrespectful? I'm holding someone accountable. Since when is that disrespectful? Since it stopped being about accountability and started being about grandstanding, Whoopi said firmly. The tension on the set was thick enough to cut. The producers off camera were making frantic gestures, but nobody was paying attention. Sunny tried once more to find middle ground. Look, I think there's a legitimate conversation to be had about media representation and influence, but maybe we could have it in a way that's less adversarial? Joy shook her head. No, Sunny. I'm tired of being polite. I'm tired of letting powerful men come on this show and say whatever they want without being challenged. Challenged is fine, Clint said, his voice still calm. But you're not challenging me, Joy. You're attacking me. There's a difference. Challenge means you ask questions and listen to answers. Attack means you've already decided the verdict and you're just looking for someone to convict. That's absolutely not what I'm doing, Joy insisted, but her voice had that edge that suggested she knew he'd hit a nerve. Isn't it? Clint asked. Because from where I'm standing, you've called my work dangerous. Why question my character, implied I'm responsible for societal violence, suggested I'm sexist, and dismissed every response I've tried to give. That's not journalism, Joy. That's a hit piece. Sarah nodded slowly. He kind of has a point, Joy. Joy's face was now bright red. I cannot believe you all are ganging up on me right now. I'm the one asking the tough questions nobody else will ask. No, Alyssa said quietly. You're asking loaded questions, designed to make yourself look brave and our guests look bad. And we can all see it. Joy slammed her hand on the desk. This is unbelievable. I bring up legitimate concerns about his body of work, and suddenly I'm the bad guy? Legitimate concerns, Clint repeated slowly, would involve actual specific examples, fair questions, and a willingness to hear responses. What you've done is make sweeping generalizations, interrupt every answer, and turn this into a performance. A performance? Joy's voice hit a new pitch. You think I'm performing? This is who I am. This is what I believe. And I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable. But somebody needs to say these things. Whoopi stepped between them, literally. Joy, I think you need to take a breath. We all need to take a breath. But Joy wasn't done. You know what, Clint? Maybe you can't handle being questioned by a woman. Maybe that's what this is really about. The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Clint looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all morning, but somehow it carried more weight. Joy, I've been questioned by women my entire career. My mother questioned me. My wife questioned me. My daughter questions me. Journalists, critics, colleagues, they've all questioned me. And I've never had a problem with it. Because they questioned me with respect, with genuine curiosity, with a desire to understand. What you're doing isn't questioning. It's condemning. And life's too short to sit here and be condemned for things I haven't done by someone who's made up their mind without knowing me. He started walking toward the exit. Joy called after him. Oh, so you're just going to run away? How typical. Clint stopped and turned back. I'm not running, Joy. I'm choosing. I'm choosing not to participate in whatever this is. You want to have a conversation? Call me. You want to have a fight? Find someone else. Whoopi touched his arm gently. Clint, you don't have to leave. He smiled at her. A real smile this time. I know, Whoopi, but I'm going to anyway. Some battles aren't worth fighting. Not because you can't win, but because winning doesn't prove anything except that you can fight. Sarah stood up too. For what it's worth, I'm sorry this turned into this. Don't be sorry, Sarah, Clint said. It's not your fault. Alyssa nodded at him respectfully as he passed. Your work speaks for itself, regardless of what anyone says here. He nodded back at her. Thank you. Joy, still at the desk, wasn't giving up. This is exactly what I'm talking about. A man gets asked hard questions, and he walks out. He can't handle it. Clint paused one more time at the edge of the stage. He looked back at Joy, and his expression was something between pity and disappointment. Joy, the hardest question anyone ever asked me was from a 6-year-old girl after a screening of Unforgiven. She asked me why the bad guy in the movie thought he was doing the right thing. That question made me think for days about morality, perspective, and how we tell stories about good and evil. Your questions today didn't make me think. They just made me tired. There's a difference between hard questions and hard feelings. I hope someday you figure that out. And then he walked off the stage. The silence he left behind was deafening. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or sit in stunned quiet. They chose quiet. Joy finally broke the silence. Well, I guess some people can't handle the heat. Whoopi turned to her slowly. Joy, I love you, but that was not your finest moment. What? Joy's defenses were fully up now. I was doing my job. Your job, Whoopi said carefully, is to engage guests in meaningful dialogue, not to prosecute them. Sunny nodded. I have to agree. That felt more like an ambush than an interview. Joy looked around at her co-hosts, seeing the disappointment in their faces. I can't believe you're all turning on me like this. Sarah spoke gently. We're not turning on you, Joy. We're just saying that maybe it went too far. He came here to talk about his new project, and it became something else entirely. It became what it needed to become, Joy insisted. Someone needed to hold him accountable. Alyssa shook her head. Accountable for what exactly? Making movies you disagree with? Having a different perspective? And that's not accountability, Joy. That's just judgment. The show cut to commercial, but the damage was done. The cameras had caught everything. The audience had seen it all. And somewhere, walking out of the studio into the bright Los Angeles sunshine, Clint Eastwood was probably shaking his head, wondering when interviews stopped being about exchange and started being about combat. Back on the set, the hosts sat in uncomfortable silence. The producers were scrambling, trying to figure out how to salvage the rest of the show. The audience was buzzing with whispered conversations. Whoopi finally spoke. "We need to talk about what just happened." Joy crossed her arms. "There's nothing to talk about. I asked tough questions. He couldn't handle it." "Joy," Sonny said carefully, "he handled it just fine. He stayed calm. And he answered clearly. He tried to engage. You were the one who kept escalating." "I was not escalating," Joy protested. "I was being direct." Sarah leaned forward. "Direct is good. Aggressive is different. And what happened out here crossed that line." Alyssa added, "I think we have to acknowledge that our job is to challenge our guests. Yes, but also to give them a fair platform. And I'm not sure we did that today." Joy stood up abruptly. "You know what? Fine. If you all think I'm the villain here, then I'm the villain. But at least I'm willing to ask the questions that matter." Whoopi stood too. "The questions that matter are asked with respect and fairness, Joy. What you did out there was neither." The cameras came back from commercial, and the host had to paste on smiles and pretend like the whole world hadn't just watched something fall apart in real time. But in living rooms across the country, people were rewinding their DVRs, watching that moment again and again. The moment when a Hollywood legend decided that dignity was worth more than publicity. The moment when a host went too far and her own panel called her out. The moment when an interview became an incident. Some would say Clint Eastwood was too sensitive, that he should have stayed and fought back harder. But those people missed the point entirely. He didn't leave because he couldn't handle the questions. He left because he recognized that some arguments aren't meant to be won. They're meant to be walked away from. And in that walk-off, in that quiet refusal to participate in manufactured outrage, he'd made his statement louder than any rebuttal could have. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to play the game. The producers scrambled to fill the remaining time. They brought out a cooking segment that had been scheduled for later. They did an extended commercial break. They did everything they could to move past what had just happened. But you can't move past a moment like that. It sits there, heavy and unavoidable. A reminder that talk shows are supposed to be about conversation, not confrontation. In the control room, directors and producers were already calculating the fallout. Social media was exploding. Clips were being shared. Think pieces were being written in real time. Everyone had an opinion about who was right, who was wrong, who went too far. The hashtags were already trending. The debate was already raging. And through it all, one thing became clear. This wasn't just an interview gone wrong. This was a cultural moment, a flashpoint, a perfect encapsulation of the broader conversations happening in society about art, responsibility, generational divides, and who gets to decide what stories are acceptable to tell. The assistants were fielding calls from news outlets wanting comments. The social media team was monitoring the reactions in real time, taking screenshots, tracking sentiment. Some people were praising Joy for speaking truth to power, for not letting a celebrity slide by on charm and reputation. Others were condemning her for ambushing a guest, for being disrespectful, for turning what should have been a conversation into a prosecution. And still others were analyzing every word, every gesture, every micro-expression, looking for hidden meanings and deeper truths. In online forums and comment sections, people were picking sides. Team Joy versus Team Clint. Those who thought she was brave versus those who thought she was rude. Those who agreed with her premise versus those who thought her methods were flawed. The debate raged on, fueled by partial clips and hot takes, and the kind of absolute certainty that the internet specializes in. But back on that stage, sitting in those chairs, the hosts knew the truth. They'd crossed a line. They'd invited someone into their house and treated them like an enemy. and one of them had stood up and walked out rather than accept that treatment. Whoopi, in her dressing room, was shaking her head. She'd been in this business for decades. She'd seen interviews go sideways before. But this was different. This was personal, in a way that made her uncomfortable. She respected Joy, considered her a friend even. But what had happened out there wasn't journalism. It wasn't even good television. It was just mean. And Whoopi had built her career on being real, being honest, but never being cruel. She'd have to think about how to address this, how to move forward. Sarah, always the optimist, was trying to find a silver lining. Maybe this would spark an important conversation about media criticism and artistic responsibility. Maybe something good could come from something uncomfortable. But even as she thought it, she knew it was wishful thinking. What people would remember wasn't a productive dialogue about complex issues. What they'd remember was a host going after a guest, a legend walking off, and a panel divided. Sonny was already thinking 3 steps ahead, lawyer brain in full effect. There were liability issues here potentially. Had they defamed him? Had they created a hostile environment? Could this lead to legal consequences? Probably not, but the questions were worth asking. More than that, though, she was thinking about credibility. When you invite someone on your show and then attack them, what does that say about your show's integrity? What guest would want to come on after this? Why would anyone trust that they'd get a fair hearing? Alyssa felt caught in the middle, as she often did. She was the newest host, still finding her footing. She'd tried to defend Clint, tried to bring some balance to the conversation, but Joy had steamrolled right over her. It was frustrating, being dismissed like that. Having your points ignored because they didn't fit the narrative someone else had decided on. She wondered if this was what every interview would be like, this constant battle to make sure all perspectives got heard, not just the loudest one. Joy kept insisting she'd done nothing wrong, but her co-hosts weren't buying it. The audience wasn't buying it. And somewhere deep down, in that place where we all know the truth, even when we don't want to admit it, Joy probably knew it too. Because at the end of the day, it wasn't about politics or movies or cultural commentary. It was about how you treat people. It was about the difference between challenging someone and attacking them. It was about remembering that the person sitting across from you is a human being, not a prop in your moral theater. Clint Eastwood had spent decades in Hollywood understanding that principle. He'd directed actors, worked with crews, collaborated with writers. He knew that the best work comes from respect, not combat. And when that respect disappeared from the view's stage, he did what any person with self-respect would do. He left. The show eventually ended. The audience filed out, still talking in excited whispers about what they'd just witnessed. Some defended Joy, saying she was just doing her job. Others felt she'd gone too far, that she'd been unnecessarily hostile. But everyone agreed on one thing. They'd never seen anything quite like that before. The hosts removed their microphones and went their separate ways, some with more to think about than others. Whoopi walked past Joy without saying a word, which spoke volumes. Sarah gave Joy a sympathetic look, but didn't engage. Sonny and Alyssa whispered to each other as they left, clearly discussing what had just transpired. Joy sat alone at the desk for a moment after everyone else had gone. The stage lights were still on, harsh and unforgiving. She looked at her notes, at the questions she'd prepared, at the narrative she'd built in her mind about how this interview would go. She'd wanted to make a statement, to show that she wouldn't back down, that she'd ask the questions nobody else would ask. But somewhere in that pursuit, something had gone wrong. Even if she wouldn't admit it out loud, some small part of her had to know it. The producers gathered in the control room, already strategizing damage control. Phone calls were being made. Publicists were being alerted. Statements were being drafted. And this wasn't just a heated interview anymore. This was a situation. This was something that would need managing, spinning, explaining. Meanwhile, out in the parking lot, Clint Eastwood got into his car, started the engine, and sat there for a moment. He'd been in this business long enough to know that moments like these become stories, become legend, become bigger than what actually happened. People would talk about this for years, probably. They'd debate it, analyze it, use it as proof for whatever point they wanted to make. And Clint? He probably went back to whatever project he was working on, surrounded by people who understood that disagreement doesn't require disrespect, that challenge doesn't require hostility, and that at the end of the day, we're all just trying to tell stories about the complicated, messy, beautiful thing called being human. He'd go back to his editing bay, or his script meetings, or his location scouts, and he'd do what he'd always done: make movies, tell stories, trust that audiences were smart enough to understand the difference between fiction and reality. Because that's what this whole thing had been about, really. Trust. Joy didn't trust audiences to think for themselves. She didn't trust that people could watch a movie about violence without becoming violent. She didn't trust that complex stories could contain complex messages. And maybe, deep down, she didn't trust that someone from a different generation, with different views, could still have something valuable to contribute. But Clint trusted all of those things. He'd built a career on that trust. He'd made films that challenged audiences, that made them uncomfortable sometimes, that asked difficult questions about morality and justice and the human condition. And he'd always believed that audiences could handle it, could think critically about it, could separate entertainment from instruction. That fundamental difference, that gulf in worldview, was what made the conversation impossible. It wasn't about movies or masculinity or media influence. It was about whether you believe people are capable of engaging with difficult material without being corrupted by it. Joy said no. Clint said yes. And in that divide, there was no bridge to be built. The view would go on. Other guests would come and go. Other controversies would erupt and fade. But that moment, that 36-second descent from interview to incident, would stick around. It would be the moment people remembered when they thought about that show, that host, that day. Because sometimes the moments that define us aren't the ones where we win arguments. They're the ones where we choose to walk away from them. And on that morning, in that studio, Clint Eastwood showed everyone watching what that choice looks like. Calm, dignified, and absolutely final. The legend had left the building, and he'd done it on his own terms.